Welcome back to the Marketing Moment. I am your host, David Barry. It's great. We've been away for just a week. We took a hiatus for the 4th of July holiday, but we are back with another episode. This week, we are talking about post-COVID consumer trends affecting digital and e-commerce in 2021. And as we talk about in each week, for those of you who are new listeners or who've been here before, I am the host, David Barry. I'm alone this week. I will have Nicole and Julia back with me on the next episode, but we are DB and Partners. We're basically an e-commerce agency. Not basically, we are an e-commerce agency specializing in brands that scale products and services for the brain and the body. So unofficially, we tell our clients and our prospects and our listeners that if your customers learn it, eat it, or wear it, we help you sell it. So as you know, each week we talk about our headlines, and another way to describe it is sort of the appetizer to the episode before we get to the main course. And we've got a couple of headlines we've picked for you, and we're going to start off right at the top. The first headline for us this week it came to us from The Verge. And basically the story is Nielsen is taking another crack at gauging our streaming habits. Now, everybody who's familiar with Nielsen in this space, if you're listening, you probably are, but they are basically the ones who've created a tracking and rating system for everything that's happening on TV. Household penetration with online media is something that they have not been able to crack as easily. But the gauge is what they're hoping will solve for that. It's a new rating system that Nielsen created, which will track households' internet traffic through their router, but it'll only measure what's viewed on a television. So it's not going to be effective on a phone or a laptop, at least not for now. As of now, at the time that we were sharing this, they have about 14,000 households that are already signed up. So not a huge number, but enough to sort of get critical mass and determine if it's viable. And according to Nielsen last month, it actually is viable. They're saying that people spent roughly 64% of their TV time watching broadcast or cable channels, and about a quarter of their time, 26% to be exact, was spent on streaming services. So this is not, necessarily earth-shattering information, but what it's going to do, and one of the things that we're intrigued by, is its ability to provide greater visibility into something that we know is a trend, right? The streaming services, which at least in theory once consolidated and made things easier, maybe have made things more complicated now that there are so many. But this is the direction things are going to. People are moving off of broadcast and cable and into streaming services on multiple different devices. Granted, there's still not going to be visibility into a core that's really important, and that's what they're watching on other devices like tablets and phones. But you've got to expect that if this works, if this is an experiment that pays off, that they'll have greater visibility moving forward into other forms of measurable TV that's not in a traditional sense. So keep an eye out for that. Of course, if we learn more, we will share that. And the second piece of information that we wanted to share this week with regard to our top headlines is TikTok. We talk about them a lot on this episode, or not necessarily this episode, but in general. And they are launching Jump. It's a third-party integration tool. This information comes to us from TechCrunch. Here's basically what we understand. It's a development tool that allows the app to expand its offerings to include third-party integrations into the platform. So as an example, an integration with the app, there's a current app called Whisk. And Whisk basically did a beta test with TikTok to test this out, to test out the launch of Jump. And essentially what it did was allowed content creators in the food space to share their recipe cards that they find on the Whisk app. That's sort of what they specialize in. But it allowed them to place those recipe cards from that app directly inside of TikTok. So saying this another way, an educational creator could link to Quizlet flashcards, for example, to review a concept that they explained in a TikTok video, or a yoga instructor could share breathing exercises on the app called Breathe through their TikTok video. And essentially, for a platform that doesn't even let all users include a link in their bio yet, you would think that this is actually really, really progressive. It expands the existing tools that creators have to engage their audience. And so we're watching this with a very close eye, because what's interesting is Facebook in particular was sort of known as a walled garden, right? Nobody wants you to leave the app, and they don't want to play nice with other apps or integrations or even news sites. In Facebook's case, they want you to basically create your own news within the Facebook app. But TikTok is jumping ahead in line and saying, let's embrace these third-party technologies. Let's give them an opportunity to expand the ways that they can interact with their own audiences by using our tool, and vice versa. Now TikTok is gaining the credibility of a lot of third-party apps that make the experience more rich. My suspicion, and I would always love Nicole and Julia's feedback on something like this, but my suspicion is that this is going to make TikTok's average time on site or on app go higher. because now you have the ability to utilize third-party technology and third-party integrations that make the experience far more rich and useful. So if you are already sharing, recipes and things like that, now you actually get to share those cards directly within the TikTok channel, and you don't have to jump between both of them to do it. Now you can do it all in one integration. And I think that's incredibly powerful. I also believe that it's going to plant the seeds for a lot of other technology in the future to maybe follow that behavior. So, unsurprisingly, TikTok has kind of blazed ahead of the competition, especially for Gen Z. And this is, I think, also going to set a trend that others are going to try to catch up on. So quickly, I imagine you're going to see Instagram in particular, probably, and maybe even Snapchat, try to find ways to follow this trend. So that's something to certainly be on the lookout for. But those are the headlines that we had for you this week. And I kept things quick and condensed. And this is a great opportunity to pivot to our episode topic for the week: consumer trends affecting digital marketing and e-commerce. So let's get to it. The emergence of e-commerce since the onset of COVID-19 is not news anymore. Like we've been dealing with it for a really, what feels like forever now. But even last summer, TechCrunch had offered data that showed the pandemic had accelerated the shift to e-commerce by a full 5 years, which feels kind of insane. But granted, we didn't think COVID was coming, and that was pretty insane too. But now, obviously, we won't be so bold as to proclaim the virus as a thing of the past, but much of the country has emerged into something that looks kind of normal thanks to the vaccine rollout over the past several months. Now, and with it, there's this sense that COVID has changed things for digital in general, but e-commerce specifically. And as an e-commerce agency, we obviously have a lot to say about that. But before we really get to the core of this, let's talk about consumer spending first, to see where it was, but then also where it is now, and kind of talk about the difference between those two states. So last year, department store sales declined by 60% for the full year. Meanwhile, e-commerce grew by nearly 20%. So there's like an 80% difference between those two. And within that, I guess, gap, so to speak, is this miniature story. So groceries, alcohol, and home improvement material sales accelerated by 12, 16, and 14% respectively. So that was last year. Essentially, in a microcosm, it's saying people were stuck at home. They didn't go to department stores. They couldn't. They were buying things online, and the things that they were buying online were food and booze and things to fix up the home that they were stuck in. I'm, of course, oversimplifying, but I don't think I'm too far off either. So again, that was last year. Now let's look at the past several months, really in 2021. We're about halfway through the year now. And the data shows a trend in this post-COVID world. So what does that look like? No category has grown more than clothing, shoes, and accessories. That's up 81% in the past 5-6 months, which is followed by sporting goods and hobby musical instruments and bookstores, which I know is kind of an amalgamation of things that seem a little disjointed, but generally we'll call it, entertainment and enrichment, up 55%. And then retail has bounced back. It's back 23%, but just not as hard as the others. I mean, when you look at sporting goods and hobbies, instruments, bookstores, and stuff like that, it pales in comparison. Number two, Amazon leapfrogged a number of players to firmly entrench itself as the number 3 digital ad platform behind Google and Facebook. I don't really think that's a surprise that the number 1 e-commerce site on earth did well, but for them to jump all the way into third place, it can't be minimized when you think about the monstrosity that Facebook and Google are. There's also, unrelated to e-commerce specifically, but its distant cousin. We'll talk about a surge in home buying, and there's obviously online components that are relevant to this as well, but it really has led to the growth of builder-based brands and opportunities for home furnishing brands. So maybe it's not the mass, urban exodus of the 1950s, but COVID has pushed home buyers into more open spaces, and it's pushed others into the purchase of second homes that they can retreat to, and if they could afford to. And the gasoline on that fire has undoubtedly been historically low interest rates on housing. My wife and I actually bought our first house a month before COVID, so thankfully we got in and settled right before the pandemic hit. But as a side note, but that has led to a surge in opportunities for brands that specialize in home furnishing and home building and remodeling. Also a shortage in lumber, but if you were at a Home Depot at any point or ordering anything from, a Lowe's or something like that, you saw firsthand the volume of people in those stores if you were brave enough to go in one, but also the delays in orders getting to you, which some of it had to do with just COVID in general, but others had to do with the high volume of demand. And that's a big part of why the lumber shortage has been an issue. And then the last thing I'll share before I kind of summarize this and wrap it in a bow is used car demand is still right now at an all-time high as automakers have struggled with production. Thanks, I guess that's sort of the wrong word, but because of a worldwide shortage of semiconductors, and it's forced them to idle plants, and it's made it difficult for dealers to keep their lots stocked. So as a result, you see drivers switching to used cars, your cargurus.com, cars.com, Auto Trader, those types of sites. And the average used car value has gone up 17% in the past year. And I think, brands that have gone even closer, to making the sale possible are finding a lot of victories in that. So I mentioned, Auto Trader and stuff like that, which are really online, sites essentially where you can just find the vehicle that you're looking for. But Carvana, I think, is one that's really worth looking at, who, as used cars have become even more valuable in the marketplace in terms of demand, but also in dollars and cents, Carvana is actually, finding ways to deliver them to people. And there's a lot of competitors emerging into that space as well. So before I get long-winded, and I know I have a tendency to do that sometimes, let's summarize this very simply. Stores were closed. People wanted to booze and order takeout. They wanted to hit the open road, and they wanted to fix that ugly ass garden that they've been avoiding for 2 years, but they started having to stare at it daily. And to meet those needs, they ordered stuff, even used cars, online. So that's great to look in the rear view. And I don't mean to languish there too much, but it is important to understand, as I mentioned at the start of this, where were things before? Where are they now? And what does that tell us about where they might be headed? And I think that's really the crux of what we want to talk about today. So people are tired of being cooped up inside. They want to pick up the volleyball or the golf clubs. They want to kickstart some new habits and then buy some clothes and accessories that make them look good and feel good as they go back in public. That is reflected in the trends that I had mentioned before, where clothing, shoes, and accessories are up 81%. So that's not just conjecture from me, but if you're a brand in some of those spaces of things that make people feel good, look good, or get to enjoy using their body in open spaces again, there are opportunities there. Now, just because people have gotten comfortable with doing more of that shopping online than they otherwise would have, is not, the only part of this story. The timeline obviously has been accelerated, but what does that mean for you as the marketer? So we know the things that are emerging as trends for shoppers, but that means that marketers have to kind of match that demand, not just in what they're selling. Yes, it's, I guess, fortuitous if you're selling the products that they're buying, but it says a lot about the fact that more people moved online to make their transactions, and they're not going backwards, right? So eMarketer, which is something that we reference on virtually every podcast, is a great research resource. If you've never followed it, you absolutely should. eMarketer says U.S. digital ad spending is growing still 25.5% this year. Total media spend is going to grow 18%, and even traditional TV is bouncing back by 5%. That's an estimate. We'll see where we are, in a few months. But digital is still outpacing traditional by 5x at this point. So marketers are going where consumers are spending. And as we showed before, that's online. Now, TV and out of home are going to bounce back after sharp declines last year. And I just gave, an example of that. TV is bouncing back 5%. And I don't want to sound too dramatic, but I don't think they're ever going to be back to where they were. Anybody who's been following digital for a long time, even without COVID, felt that this was coming. And then you see that the expedition, so to speak, or speaking about how fast this is happening, was 5x faster, brought it 5 years faster. Connected TV is pushing out linear TV. That's not new. The caveat is I actually do expect out of home to fare better than most traditional media as we go forward, because there's a limited supply of that. And this is also an environment where people really are out in the open and seeing, out of home forms of media that they respond to, and especially popular in the event space and things like that. We work with a lot of food festivals. And so I think that's still a popular form of out of home. But as a marketer, you've got to understand where your consumers are now going. And that has changed, and it's probably going to continue to change. So let's talk about the so what of that, right? So just because people are on digital more doesn't mean to default to the thing that a lot of people were doing before, which frankly is just saying, oh, well, digital equals Facebook and Google. It doesn't. It's created a logjam on the top channels like Facebook and Google because so many people are now moving into digital faster. So they're not a good value anymore. I'm not saying Facebook and Google are to be abandoned in your marketing plans. Quite the opposite. I think they're almost mandatories at this point. But you have to look harder. Let's also talk, about Amazon. There's definitely a causal relationship to what's happening there. They're not just because of the pandemic, but some other things, right? They're seeing an unprecedented shift in ad spend from both post-pandemic consumer behavior paired with the hit that Facebook ads and others, including Google, are taking with the iOS 14 update in the last few months. So as a result, Amazon is seeing the fastest growth in digital ad revenue this year among the big players. So that's important component to keep in mind. And it's not just digital or traditional, it's about the evolution of both. So with businesses opening back up, vaccine rollouts, mask mandates getting lifted, all that stuff, fewer people are spending all of their time on digital. So yes, the rollout to digital prior to the vaccines, when people were still locked at home, was a big shift. But now that the normalcy, the quote unquote normalcy, has returned, there is still an opportunity for some of the traditional things to reemerge, as I had mentioned. So where does that leave you, the e-commerce brand, right? In summary, we know that digital has emerged and it's not slowing down, but traditional is inching back as well. And with all of the competition that's happening on digital, there are still opportunities on traditional. So it's not picking one or the other, right? It's always about going wherever your customer is. And I don't really care if it's on a device or, in their hands or on a television screen. So here are my 4 takeaways, and then we'll wrap this thing up. We'll talk about the marketing malfunction, which we always finish off with. Number 1, double down on the quality of your e-commerce offering. The demand for e-commerce brands or e-commerce transactions, beating a dead horse here, has never been greater, but it is not enough to just offer things for sale online. You've got to meet your customer needs, and you have to obsess over the quality of that experience. We have a blog in our archives that you can check that out. That's at dbpadv.com. And we actually talked about this in a previous episode of the podcast, which you can listen to as well. Number 2, find the opportunities that others are missing. And I promise you, they are missing them. I mentioned Facebook and Google, right? Like everybody is saying, oh, digital's hot, so we've got to go on Facebook and Google. Look, I'm spitballing here, but as people move back to the burbs, there are opportunities to push landscaping and home maintenance services online. This is just an example that I'm popping up with. You could create home remodeling kits with checklists for all the items you need to redo a bathroom, for instance. And in the used car market, you can do hyper-local ad campaigns and maybe even take your sales team into the neighborhoods to transact without stepping foot into a dealership. People don't want to be on foot. They've gotten used to certain things and they don't want to have the experience, particularly in car dealerships. I think there are opportunities to bring that experience to people's doors instead of the opposite. So I think if you're an advertiser, you can buy up effective but discounted ad opportunities in places that there's less competition. If your customer is still there, then it's basically just on sale. Number 3, embrace Amazon with one eye open. No brand is excited to join Amazon and give up a chunk of their customer data, so I get that. But your competitors are taking your market share on that channel if you're sitting out. So I would say embrace it with one eye open, and that means consider ways to acquire new customers there, then figure out ways to get them to your site or your stores for subsequent transactions. I'm going to leave that as an open-ended cliffhanger, as something to think about offline. Maybe it'll be a topic of conversation for another day, because I think Amazon's obviously not going away. And number 4, the last one, and I'll wrap this in a bow, move quickly. Opportunities do not wait, and they're not always there for a long time either. But if you overanalyze and you overthink, someone else is going to beat you to the punch. And we saw a lot of examples of that through COVID, and we're still seeing it now. Know your customer, know your product, and act with confidence. So I'm going to wrap that in a bow for you. I told you I have this tendency to perhaps get a little bit long-winded, but let's wrap it up with the marketing muzzle and the malfunction. We wrap them into one, and I'll give credit to Nicole who picked this one out. I don't know which is which, but if it's muzzle or malfunction, but I'll let you decide. So in short, there was a California woman who sued Red Lobster for deceptive advertising of sustainable Maine lobster. And in summary, here's basically what happened. This woman from Southern California, backed by a class action lawsuit with a law firm, was suing Red Lobster for deceptive advertising in federal court because she says they falsely claimed that lobster from Maine is a sustainable fishery that follows the highest standards. But as it turns out, both sides kind of lost here. Red Lobster, for reasonable evidence of deceptive advertising, it was validated. Um, but the woman, as Nicole argued, I'm going to try to speak for her, but she said the lady should have never really followed the belief that Red Lobster was following the highest standard in the first place. But I, this one was more entertaining than anything for the muzzle and the malfunction. Customers have to continue to do their homework to make sure they know where they're getting their products from. And, that's a conversation for another day as generations start to care a lot more about sustainability as a value. And for all that Red Lobster is and all that Beyonce says about Red Lobster, it is not necessarily a brand that is admired for its sustainability practices, as this woman learned and apparently won this lawsuit. So if we find out more details on it, we'll let you know. But that is all we have for today. Look forward to getting Nicole and Julia back on our next episode. If you enjoyed this, we encourage you to share it with your peers. If you have questions, we would love to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe wherever it is that you're tuning in. And we look forward to coming back to you again next week. Thanks again.